This podcast was recorded on the ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation.
This is Humans on Rights, a podcast advocating for the education of human rights. Here's your host, Stuart Murray.
Diane Roussin is an Anishinaabe community leader passionately committed to the pursuit of mino, bimaadiziwin, the good life for all families and children. She's going to let me know if I nailed that or not. Her in-depth knowledge of Indigenous issues and solutions flow directly from her strong sense of identity and worldview. She is a proud member of Skownan First Nation, a Treaty 2 territory. She is currently and has been for some time the leader and the project director of the Winnipeg Boldness project, which is an ambitious social innovation initiative seeking to create large-scale systems change for children and families in the Point Douglas neighborhood. Diane serves on the board of directors of Animikii Indigenous Technology, the Winnipeg Foundation, and the Winnipeg Art Gallery. She is a member of the Indigenous Advisory Council at the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies, and she chairs the Indigenous Innovation Initiative Council. She has presented at TEDx. She's been awarded the Governor General's Meritorious Service Medal for Outstanding Indigenous Leadership, and she has been the recipient of the Manitoba Women Trailblazers Award by the Nellie McClung Foundation. Now, I'm exhausted just reading, and I left so much stuff out, Diane, but what an incredible life journey you've had so far. I just want to say I'm delighted, and I want to welcome to this episode of Humans on Rights.
Well, anayin Stuart, and thank you for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
Of course, I had to edit so much out because I know you've done so much, and we're going to talk about your life journey, Diane, because I think that's really what this podcast is about, talking about the education of what it is that you're doing in the Boldness Project. But just to kind of start it off as we get to know you, you're extremely busy. You're an incredible leader. Let's start off by asking you, how do you start your day?
In this online world, I unfortunately start my day by looking at my phone and trying to return as many messages as I can. And you're right. I mean, I think all of us are busy, and I always say there's always good busy, and then there's that grinding busy. But definitely, I think there's a lot of work to be done out there. And for myself, being asked to participate in so many different conversations, I do view myself as being very privileged and very lucky to be invited in. You've sort of referenced sort of my upbringing or my life's work. And, I can remember in my early days of working here in Winnipeg, where I wasn't invited into circles. And as a matter of fact, I was one of those young folks that sort of down on the ledge with my bullhorn, leading marches down to City Hall and, really having to create awareness in that way. And so, having to be, we talk about sort of advocacy and different things like that. And so over time and where I'm at today, you mentioned some of the things I'm involved in. I'm now actually invited into the room. There's actually sometimes a place mat or a place card with my name on it. I have a seat reserved. And more, I'm actually asked to stand at the front of the room with a microphone and say a few things, which is kind of a little bit about, you inviting me here. And so I've seen that evolution just in my lifetime alone.
And what do you think has been kind of the progenitor? Why is that happening, Diane? Do you think, I don't want you to be modest because, you are a leader. You've been recognized as such, but you're also operating in a system, and we're going to talk about systems, but you're operating in an environment where, as you say, for the longest time, you were asked maybe to attend, but could maybe stand at the back of the room. Now that's reversed and you're at the front of the room. What do you put that down to?
Well, thank goodness we are evolving and developing as a country. I can make the moral imperative on that. I can make the business imperative on that. There's a lot of reasons why that's happening. Obviously, one of the most significant in more recent memory is things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with its calls to action. And I think the country has really, embraced that, and people are really leaning into that conversation. So I'm very, again, thankful and grateful for the work that's happened there. The missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the the Calls to Justice report there. I think we're, these issues are now so front and center that we can't just ignore them. And folks, want to be a part of the solution. And so trying to understand, the history, the real history of this country, or at least all of our histories of this country, and then trying to figure out how do we move forward and how might we, build a better Canada and build a better Manitoba and a better, Winnipeg for all of us. So I do think there's more appetite now than perhaps when I was starting out in my career. Certainly growing up, if I could touch on that a little bit. On one hand, I can say now that I'm very privileged that I was raised by my parents. I was raised with my siblings. I always knew who my people were. I knew who my family was. I knew where my land base was, talk about Skownan First Nation. My mother was physically born there. She wasn't born in a hospital. She was born by the aunties and cuckoos, right there on that land. And I know all the way through, like I know who I can go all the way up to know who my great, 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 great grandfolks are all the way through to my ancestors, in the reality of colonization, the reality of residential schools, and lots of people were taken away. Lots of people were stolen. Lots of people don't know their and were not raised up with their communities and with their families. And so I had that. Now paired with that, there's always all kinds of sides to these stories. I grew up in grinding poverty. We had no money and we were really poor. I grew up with, things like family violence and alcoholism and lots and lots of racism, which obviously continues to this day. I am very obviously Indigenous, and so I walk in this world as an Indigenous woman, and I've been treated as such. And again, in the earlier days, there was a lot of negative, acts of racism that I experienced. But I also, being a First Nations woman, and I know we might get into this maybe a little bit later on, I happen to be classified as having treaty status. And so I have a number and which is connected to this thing called the Indian Act, which is, in our constitution. And so that's really, which I would maybe chalk up to some systemic racism, along with those individual acts of racism. So, growing up, that has been my reality, my experience, which has really shaped my views of the world, and that has led me into the work I'm doing today and all the things that I'm involved in right now here in Winnipeg and across the country, which is really about centering Indigenous voices in so many things.
So a couple of things there I just want to sort of circle back on with you, Diane. You mentioned the fact that you have a treaty number, so you have treaty status. That was a change, right? Because I think if I understand correctly, when women left the reserve, did they lose their treaty status at one time?
Yes, there was a history where again, through the Constitution, there's some what we call sometimes Indian or Constitution math. Doesn't always make a lot of sense, but there's a way to where the status can be passed down through generations. And so in the past, there were ways that the men could pass it on, but the women couldn't. And so there's been a few amendments to the Constitution on that front, Bill C-31 and some others. And so that has been amended a bit. I still think there's flaws in it, but again, there's I think a lot of flaws in the Indian Act period, but yeah.
Yeah. So no, thanks for sharing that. And then the other thing, I just wanted to get your thoughts, because I really appreciate, the kind of work that you're doing through the Boldness Project and other areas that you're involved with your leadership. You mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation. I mean, that whole commission, it really gripped the country, I believe. I just happened to be very fortunate, I should say, to have an opportunity to spend some time with, at that time, one of the commissioners who was on the board of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, Willie Littlechild, and also with the commissioner, Murray Sinclair. Amazing people. I guess the one thing that I would ask, Diane, from your perspective, the report was presented, the commission disbanded. We have a center here, the Truth and Reconciliation Center here is in Winnipeg, Manitoba. You mentioned that you felt great about that. I mean, I just would love to get your sense of how you see that has had a positive impact. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done on that project, but there's baby steps, right, to move this thing forward. So how would you put into words some of the things that you would sort of say, look, since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has made their presentations and their recommendations, here's where I see this country moving in a very positive direction. Just maybe give some thoughts, some specific examples that you can see, because I think we need to share more and more of these, because it's so easy to go back to some of the challenges we've had, and they still are there. But let's talk about some of the successes from your perspective, please.
Well, I do think that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in all of its work, it was some very heavy lifting to do that work. And it's had a lot of staying power. And I think I was really worried in the early days that, this will have its, year and then Canada would move on from this conversation. But Canada hasn't, and Canada has stayed in the conversation and continues to stay in the conversation. So I'm very, happy to see that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been built upon, other big studies and big commissions in the past. And so we definitely, if you read through the calls to action, almost all of them, I think, reference UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so that's another document that we need to go to, and because that one, predates the TRC. And there's a lot of really important pathways, if you will, action items, things we can do in the UNDRIP. We had RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, like that was massive, which again had a lot of recommendations. It had a lot of suggestions in there, a lot of pathways, a lot of things that we can do as Canadians to make this country a better place for all of us. And again, there's just so many different things we can do, and there is something for every single one of us in all of these reports. And of course, I mentioned earlier about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so if you haven't read those 213 calls to justice, I would encourage you to do so. So there's a lot of ways for us to engage in these conversations. There's a lot of ways for us to take the action. There's a lot of, from sort of the small steps to the big steps. I just think there's so much in front of us that, and maybe at times it feels overwhelming, but at least I'd rather be overwhelmed than underwhelmed with options. The truth is hard. The truth of this country and colonization and all the different things such as, residential schools, all of that is very hard to hold, to hear, to understand, to know. My mother, went to the day schools, right? That was right in Skownan First Nation, and so, I would be considered, an intergenerational survivor of the residential school. I personally don't speak my Anishinaabe language to this day because my mother was born speaking her language. It was her first language, and she was schooled to not speak it. She still speaks it to this day, but was, very
That's
much
impressive.
To not speak it. Yeah, my mom and dad spoke Anishinaabe to each other my whole life. But what the school was successful in doing was to convince my parents not to teach it to the next generation. So me and my siblings were not taught to speak Anishinaabe because my parents were taught that English is a superior language and that as children, we would be more successful in this world if we spoke English. And so, that got sort of beaten into them, and that's what they did. And so here we are. My siblings our first language was the English language. And so, I think in the early days, we'll talk about the Indian Act. I know that's a conversation. My mom being somebody who was a member of a First Nation community, what, in the past we called reservations, she was not allowed to leave the reserve. That was a thing that happened where people could not leave the reserve. And so this idea of trying to make it better for your children so they could have a better life than what she was living, she bought into that. And for a while, that was true. And I think now times have changed, and now we're really trying hard to lean into language revitalization because we don't want to lose our language. So I appreciate, Stuart, using the language at the top of the show. And so the mino, bimaadiziwin, that you would actually, that you would try to say that, because I think it's important for all of us to try to use the words and to understand what those concepts mean and to, again, reclaim those, and there's so much, Winnipeg and Manitoba. There's so many, what we think are English words are actually not English words. They're actually Indigenous words that have been changed a little bit, or the pronunciation has changed a little bit, but they're actually a lot of Indigenous words.
And that's kind of part of, I think, the evolution that you refer to, Diane, that the country is starting to embrace. There's so much work to be done when you look at, the recommendations that came out of the TRC. And I guess part of me always looks at that and says, I just have to look in the mirror, because what am I doing? How am I doing to sort of embrace those? What am I learning? And what's my takeaway from that? And just would love to get your thoughts on this sort of comment, Diane. At the top of my podcast, I have a pre-recorded land acknowledgement. And a lot of events now happen with a land acknowledgement before the event happens. And I've had this conversation with a good friend of yours, a good friend of mine, Negan Sinclair. And I've asked if, are we at a point now where the land acknowledgement is almost like checking a box? Like, let's just make sure we do a land acknowledgement and then we'll get on with the program. And, I've likened it a little bit, Diane, to the point that when you get on an airplane, these people are standing up, giving you all sorts of security. And it's very important what they're saying, but everybody's looking at their BlackBerry or their iPhone or their whatever it may be. And so now we have this significant land acknowledgement, which is incredibly meaningful if you want to listen to the words and appreciate and understand it. Or it can become just something about, oh, by the way, did we do a land acknowledgement? Yes, we did. Okay, great. What's this meeting about again? And you kind of race past it. And I just, wanted to get your thoughts, and please tell me I'm wrong.
You talk about the airplane. What I love about the airplanes now is the flight stuff is on the screen. And so they always do a really nice land acknowledgement right on the screen when they're telling you how to buckle up and so on and so forth, and not smoke on a plane or whatever. So I love that there's that land acknowledgement right in there. But yeah, talk about a land acknowledgement. Here's how I sort of piece it all together for myself, or how I see it as being super interconnected. We have to understand the truth, and it's hard. Like, the truth is hard. There has been some pretty nasty things done to Indigenous people, not only Indigenous people, but certainly Indigenous people in Canada. And, I really do feel like our Indigenous values, our Indigenous worldviews, our existence was very connected to the land. And so we weren't even human centric. We talk about all my relations. We understood that mino bimaadiziwin, to live the good life, is to live a peaceful life, and knowing that you are connected to all my relations. And so the interconnectedness, understanding that interconnectedness is what leads to that peaceful, really good life. And so all my relations are the land, the water, the trees, the animals, and recognizing we are but one. And so our job, the mino bimaadiziwin, to live the good life, is to live in good balance with all my relations. So we had this concept, and we were tied to the land in a way, like we called the land Mother Earth, right? And so she's our mother. And so we relate to her like our mother. You take care of your mother, she takes care of you. It's reciprocal, it's mutual. You worry about what makes my mother happy, what makes my mother healthy, what are the things I need to do to ensure those things, because she does that for me. And so we think about the land in that way. And so we were very much, therefore, caretakers of the land. We had an accountability to the land. We had a responsibility to the land. And so we were caretaking the land for all of these years, like millennia, to the point where when settlers came, the land was in a very good place, and it was the land of plenty, right? There was an abundance. And I think, folks with other worldviews or value bases came and saw that, and, having a more, whether it be a transactional, capitalistic, extractional kind of a, view of things, where you want to now manage the land and harness the land. Like, I would never talk about my mother in terms of trying to manage her and control her and harness her. Like, I just would never use that language when I'm talking about my maternal mother, right? So I think there was a real attempt to remove that relationship between Indigenous people and the land. And one of the ways to do that was to cut out our language, try to erase our language, try to erase our ceremony, try to erase our our values, just erase us. And so that's what colonization was all about. That's what the residential schools was a part of. And that's what the TRC is trying to show, right? And so we were put on these little plots of land, our traditional territories that we would have been responsible for got reduced to very small plots of land called reservations, as another way to try to disconnect us from the land. It was illegal for us to practice our culture. It was illegal for us to practice our ceremony across this country. And so much of our ceremony is, the foundation of our language. It's the connection to the land. So again, just all these attempts to sever. And that's what the colonization was about. And so the TRC is about, acknowledging that, collecting the stories of how that, that severing took place in so many different ways. But you talk about the hope of it, the TRC also pointed out, how might we take action now to reclaim, revitalize, create restitution, like all the different things, like how might we create a better path moving forward? And so I think Marie might have been the person, Marie Sinclair, the Honorable Marie Sinclair would have been the person to say, we have shown you the mountain. It is now up to you to figure out how to climb it. And that is the work in front of us, is how to climb it. So I do think, we definitely have a lot of work in front of us. I think lots of us are doing really cool work. And like I said, there's like small steps you can take, there's big steps you can take. But I think acknowledging that history is huge. Like, we just can't move forward unless we as a nation, as Canada, as a country, acknowledge the actual fact. Because then we don't understand why we're in I talked about growing up in grinding poverty. I didn't understand why that was, because it wasn't just me. It was all the people who looked like me lived in poverty. And I just thought that was the way we were. And so I know now that the systems that are in place, Indian Act being one of them, there is, historic and institutional racism in place to this day that many Canadians continue to benefit from, that led to such impoverished conditions for particularly Indigenous people, because we're not teaching it in our school systems. I don't know if Canadians know that to live our culture, it was outlawed, that we weren't allowed to leave the reserves, that we were systematically cut out of the Canadian economy. And so, we wonder why Indigenous people don't have, intergenerational wealth, right? We don't have those kinds of assets because we were put on these little plots of land and cut out of the Canadian economy. And so now when we think about how do we move forward, we can talk about things like economic reconciliation. How do the people in this country who have most of the wealth, how do they acquire that wealth, right? Those are can be some very tough conversations. And a lot of people don't even know that history.
I want to just sort of leap forward a little bit to say, look at all of those challenges that came for First Nations through colonization, through all of those things, that, the act of giving this little piece of land. Let's take that little piece of land called Point Douglas, and let's take the fact that you are and have been for a number of years now leading a project, which I just think was whoever came up with the idea of calling the Winnipeg Boldness Project, deserves a standing ovation, because it could have been a project about lots of things, but to call Boldness, it really started to set it aside and say, no, we are going to look at this in a way that has never been looked at before. So, all of a sudden you get people's attention. So in your words, Diane Roussin, who's been leading this project, what is the Winnipeg Boldness Project? And then I want to try to sort of drill down on some of the prototypes that you've been looking at and some of the success that you've gotten, because I know success builds success, and that's what you've been driving for. So original question to you, Diane, what is the Winnipeg Boldness Project, when you started it and when you got involved in it, and maybe now talk about some of the things you've seen over the number of years you've been involved?
Sometimes I know it can be a little bit confusing to talk about social innovation and social labs and platforms. But if there's one thing you could take away about the Winnipeg Boldness Project, know this. What the Winnipeg Boldness Project is doing is centering Indigenous wisdom, Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous value bases, Indigenous views of the world. It is centering our ways of knowing, being, doing, and feeling in all that we do. So it's centering that in trying to identify what we think the challenges and problems are facing us as Indigenous people, And it's relying on that to design the solutions, which are those prototypes you talked about. And so that, I think, is one of the biggest missteps of this country, is to not center Indigenous experiences, voices, values, wisdoms, knowledge systems in the conversation about what do we do moving forward to help or to create different scenarios and pathways for Indigenous people. Again, so part of the truth of the matter is that we haven't been. There are so many systems out there, and it can be justice systems, education systems, child welfare systems, you name it. All of those systems are designed for, especially here in Canada, in Manitoba and Winnipeg, we have such large Indigenous populations in the prairies, in a per capita sense, and even just in vast numbers, that there are so many systems. They're so expensive too. There's a lot of money being put into those systems, and they are designed quite a bit for Indigenous people. They're supposed to help make life better for us. They're supposed to help have better health and wellness outcomes. That's notionally what those systems are supposed to be doing. The real sad fact and the truth of the matter is that those systems are not helping our health and wellness outcomes in a positive way. And at their very worst, those systems are actually harming our families, tearing our families apart, tearing our villages apart, tearing our nations apart. And so that's the problem. The solution of it for me, again, is involve Indigenous people to think about what do we actually see the problem as being, and then involve us in figuring out how do we then create different pathways, different solutions, different ways of approaching this. And so, I was very privileged my whole life. But I tell you once again, I was raised up in a certain way, so very privileged, there. And then I came into Winnipeg to go to school. I went to university, and I was looking, and I had done a little bit of, had worked a little bit in the child welfare system. Was very angry, very disillusioned at what I saw there in terms of it was all Indigenous kids, hardly any Indigenous workers, staff, and certainly not using any Indigenous approaches in how we were caring for kids. I was super angry. I was looking for something different. And I thought, okay, I got to go to school. I got to, get into policy, or I got to get to the decision makers. I got to figure out how to make change, because this can't be, like, this is not working. And what I did was I somehow, stumbled into the north end of Winnipeg. So I wasn't raised here, but stumbled into the north end of Winnipeg and walked right into the Indigenous matriarchs. And so again, I'm not sure if they found me or if I found them, but we found each other, and they took me under their wing, and I have been there ever since. And those, again, there obviously were a lot of Indigenous men too, but from my personal experience, I was really shaped by the Indigenous women. That's who I gravitated towards. And again, there wasn't only Indigenous women, there was other women, there were other men too, but really who I really took to were the Indigenous women leaders who were running everything in the North End. They were running all the organizations, and they were systems thinkers. That was the other piece. What they said resonated with me. What they were doing resonated with me. And the first thing that they really affirmed with me is our people are not the problem. The systems are the problem. Our people are just trying to be who they are. They're trying to live and thrive and be, do great for their kids and just live a good life. But the systems are getting in their way. And so our job is to push back those systems and then try to change those systems. And that is what the Boldness Project has been built upon and continues to try to do. And a lot of those Indigenous matriarchs are still involved with Boldness. Again, I say Boldness has been around for 10 years. Boldness is built upon their knowledge and generations of work that they have done in the inner city of Winnipeg.
So how is it that Point Douglas became the center for the Boldness Project?
Well, Point Douglas is a little bit of a technical term, because we have different ways of drawing boundaries in our cities, and so we needed to figure out how we might tap into data sets. And so capital P Point, capital D Douglas has boundaries, street boundaries, and it has postal codes, and it has data sets that we can tap into. So that's the technical answer to the Point Douglas. But I think that others were attracted to what, I would affectionately call the North End because of the strength of the collaborations, the strength of the knowledge, the strength of we have so many strong Indigenous-led organizations serving Indigenous families. Like there's a real strength in the North End. And I think that's the thing that really attracted, the different stakeholders to be a part of this thing called the Winnipeg Boldness Project. And like I say, then we just sort of had to figure out the technical aspects of data sets and so on and so forth later. So, but I would say it was the North End and all of the amazing work happening in the North End. And again, I think our Indigenous matriarchs, they understand in a very sophisticated way what the problems are, but an even more sophisticated way, they have been working from a strengths-based approach about how we build on the strengths of our people and creating opportunities for our people to come and serve and give of their strengths in all of our organizations. And so that's the beauty of what's happening and the hope and the resilience and the path forward that's happening in the North End is that our folks know how to create conditions where children and families can thrive. And so the problem becomes there's so many systems that are getting in the way of that. How might we then change systems? Which is why we talk as the Winnipeg Boldness Project. It is a social innovation platform. And for me, the definition, one of the most pointed definitions of social innovation is that we're trying to create systems change. And that's why I got involved with the Winnipeg Boldness Project, is because it was positioning itself as a social innovation platform. I didn't fully understand what social innovation was back then. That language was new to me. But as soon as they said systems change, I knew exactly that that's what we've been working on in the North End for generations. And I knew, okay, this is something that I want to be a part of. And this is something I want to help build the infrastructure and ecosystem around so that we might do more of this. Because it was something that could then really benefit the Indigenous-led organizations that are doing that heavy lifting work in the North End.
So you talk about systems change. And, I was on your Winnipeg Boldness Project website, which is a great website. I would encourage everybody to go and look at it because there's some great work and lots to learn from that website, Diane. But you talk about systems change and you talk about child-centered ideas. For those people that might be listening and saying, Diane keeps talking about systems and system change. What are systems and what system changes are you specifically referring to? And how are you looking at making some of those changes and over the course of time? And as you say, this has been not the last 10 years at the Winnipeg Boldness Project. It's gone way, way before that. But now you're into it. Share some of your thoughts on some of these systems that need changing and how you're going about doing that.
I also, you had mentioned at the top of the hour, I was fortunate enough to do a TED Talk. And so I had laid out a little bit of this there as well. But when you look at stats, for instance, and so I have to do a little plug for data sovereignty there. The more that Indigenous people can be in charge of their own data in terms of determining what gets collected, how it gets collected, how it gets stored, analyzed, how we then use it to generate different kinds of information reports. We need to be in charge of that. And that's the Indigenous data sovereignty piece that I will say.
And I'm going to just stop you there for a second, Don, because I think I saw you on social today. That specific issue you put out there about why Indigenous people are fighting for data sovereignty. So, it fits very much with where you're going.
Yeah. And that's, again, one of the boards I sit on is the Animikii Corporation, which is the largest Indigenous tech company in North America. And so they're really pushing to for Indigenous data sovereignty. And so it's really a great organization to be a part of. So with that, the data is showing us that, over 90% of the kids that are in the care of a child welfare system in Manitoba are Indigenous. And we're like right now at the top, at the highest, probably 20% of the population, anywhere from, 15 to 20% of the population. We're projected to be soon 25% of the population, which is another one of those business imperatives about why we need to, really get things right with Indigenous people. But right now we're about 20%. Why is it that 90 or more % of the kids in care are Indigenous? And it is not because we don't know how to care for our kids, right? There's something else happening there, creating those kinds of numbers and outcomes. If you look at the justice system, the conservative number is that 70% of those incarcerated are Indigenous. again, it's not because we're criminals. There is something going on in society that is creating those conditions, creating those outcomes, and creating those numbers. I can go on. Who is not being employed? Who is not getting educated? Who is the most unhealthiest, whether it be, diabetes or anything else? Who is suffering the most from the mental health issues? The Indigenous numbers are almost always overly represented. And again, it's not because we don't know how to go to school. It's not, we don't know how to learn. We don't know how to start businesses. Like it's not our individual capabilities and capacities. There are systems in place that are creating those conditions. The racy thing to say, and I love the work of Cindy Blackstock. If you followed anything she's doing, like she is doing amazing work. And I know she has lots of really good people around her. But if you Google Cindy Blackstock, you'll see a lot there. I had the privilege of spending just a bit of time with her throughout my time at Boldness. And, I had talked about those systems being broken because they're not, creating the kinds of health and wellness outcomes for Indigenous people that we would want. And she said, she corrected me. And she said, those systems are not broken. Those systems are actually doing exactly what they were designed to do. And that really is a awful thought to have. But it's correct and it's true. And I now realize, like because those systems do benefit somebody. They are benefiting. And so that's the question that we really need to ask ourselves is who is benefiting? And so again, I feel like that's a really good question for Canadians to ask themselves is what am I benefiting and why am I benefiting and who isn't benefiting, right? That is a very important question and conversation to have in this country. So those are the stats, right? Which say, these are systems, they're having harmful effects on our families. So we need to center the Indigenous experience when we're trying to think about different ways to either change those systems or to design different systems. And so, again, back to the Boldness Project, that's what that platform is set up to do, is to be a place where Indigenous people can come. We can build the trusting relationships that allow us to think about different things that haven't necessarily maybe been thought about before, or we can take risks. We can do the emergence, the iteration. It's very startup. It feels very startup-y. That's why we do rely on and connect a lot with folks in the entrepreneurial world and in the business world, because, in a corporate environment, people wouldn't question the amount of, say, budget or time, energy spent on research and development. We have computers, phones, cars, you name it. We design prototypes. We test them. We don't just make one thing and throw it in the market. Like, we want to make sure that this product or service is going to really meet the needs of the consumer, right? So there's a lot of R&D that goes into the development of a product to make sure we got it right, so the thing will then be very useful and sell and make billions of dollars, right? I mean, that is the thinking behind R&D, some of the thinking behind R&D. We never actually apply that on the social side. So if the justice system isn't working, the child welfare system isn't working, where is there R&D space to try different things, to try different solutions, like, just experiment. And so Boldness does that. We're into like the 12 different prototypes at various stages right now. We get our community to weigh in on what they think the problem is. We get our community to think about what the solution might be. Our community is engaged in all these different ways in the design of the prototype. Then we go to test the prototype. And so it's actual families that are testing the prototype. And we have these rapid feedback loops and, things like that. And then our families are able to tell us what's working for them and what's not working for them. And so, at some point we get to a place where we think we've got this prototype to a place where families are pretty happy with it. And then that's the thing we want to hold up to decision makers, policy makers, funders, allies, you name it. We want to hold those solutions up as promising practices. We call them POPs in our world. Proofs of possibility is what we call our POPs. And so there are a lot of people who get attracted to that. And so back to this, we all have a role. Certainly Indigenous voices are what's centered, but Indigenous people by and of themselves need lots and lots of allies and stakeholders to get us to a place of, say, a fully scaled, totally embedded idea or concept, in these prototypes. So the other piece about the Social Innovation Lab is that we are a cross-sector collaboration. We have people involved in our lab that are from the corporate sector, they're from government, they're from philanthropic sector, they're from, the community, universities, you name it, because the world is moving in a different way now. We are facing global challenges like we have never faced before. Leadership is now required to be able to deal with issues of complexity. I think, we can't work in these siloed, sort of ways anymore. And so instead of a siloed way, we need to understand our interconnections way more. And I think that Indigenous knowledge systems hold complexity quite well. They are able to really understand the interconnectedness of all the moving parts. We call that holistic thinking. And so I think it's time for Indigenous knowledge systems to step forward and, be used in the design of some of these solutions that are trying to tackle these big, global issues, and not only, global issues, but right here in the North End, the Indigenous knowledge systems can be used to design solutions that better meet the needs of all my relations. Again, not trying to be human-centric here.
Yeah. So, Diane, let's just take a second, if we could, and just explore one of the prototypes you mentioned 12, and I just sort of, when I went through them, I picked out a couple, but let's just talk about one. And one of this support for dads, increasing family togetherness. Talk a little bit about that prototype and how it's doing from your sense. I mean, I guess pops, if that's the right way to sort of look at it, but how are you feeling about that particular prototype?
The idea is not new. It's been around. And so again, some of these concepts have been around in our community for a long, long time, but I don't know that it had really had as much traction or, maybe as much structured kind of resourcing as I'm starting to see now. And so, in Indigenous community, we know that it takes a village. And so there's a role for men, and, we have a continuum of folks that it takes to raise children. And so certainly there's male roles. And I think that the way that many of our systems are designed, it's to separate families and it's to separate out men and women. And so, we're trying to say that what the Supports for Dad was able to do was get some resources in place where we could actually go talk directly to dads and ask them, what is it that you need? What do you see your role as being? And so they just told us. And, Stuart, I know it sounds maybe just too simple or too Pollyanna, I'm not sure, but people don't go and ask the dads that question. And again, if you relate that to a lot of what we're talking about in the Indigenous community, we don't go and ask Indigenous people what they think. And so like in the child welfare, in the justice, in the health, like we don't actually ask Indigenous people what they think. And if we do, you're probably familiar with some of these concepts about duty to consult. And, we are way past the consulting stage. Like we're just moved on from there. We're now at a place of full-on engagement. Like you have to have full-on engagement with Indigenous people if your initiative is going to be successful. And if you don't, again, we can make the business imperative about, how that's going to hold up and cost you so much money if you don't engage in this relationship from the outset and all the way through. If you don't involve Indigenous people in these issues, like it's just going to lead to stalls and lawsuits and opposition and all these different things for your projects. And so it's the same with those systems, is that we're just going to continue to spend so much money on these systems and to have these outcomes where it's harming families. I would bet that most Winnipeggers, Manitobans, Canadians do not want systems to harm families. I'm just going to guess that most of us wake up with really good intentions, but we're just not aware that that's happening. And if people knew that was happening, I think there would be more outrage than there is. But then people want to know, okay, well, then what do we do, right? And so that's the idea of, okay, what do we do? And I think there's lots of spaces and places that we can lean into to figure out what to do. And I'll tell you, like we just had our budget come down, Manitoba budget come down, yesterday. I have some very old numbers that I need to refresh. The pandemic kind of interfered with that a little bit. But in 2018, the child welfare system cost for the provincial government over $500 million. Like that is not a little bit of money. And to say that we're investing $500 million into something that's supposed to protect children, when in fact is actually harming children, like that, we got to do something different there. And there's more and more data and research that's showing the longer Indigenous children are in child protection, the worse their health and wellness outcomes are when they come out of that system. The more prone they are to mental health issues, the more prone they are to homelessness, the more prone they are to lack of education and employment, so on and so forth. That is not protecting children. And so again, I would say the same with, justice, health, education, so on and so forth. So we're starting to see, I can point to all kinds of things where there's changes. And like you say, we're talking about the prototypes at Boldness. I'm starting to see more and more funded and ongoing funded dads programs, like they're popping up all over the place. And so where men can come together and talk about their role as men. And again, men call each other out and they, take responsibility and they keep each other accountable about what's their role. And so, there's a lot of really great men at work in the North End who are really trying to create that change and create those spaces so that men can do that work.
One question and then one comment, and then we'll, as they say, hit the off ramp on this conversation, which I appreciate so much. What you're doing in terms of the Boldness project in Point Douglas, do you think you could lift what you're doing from that project in Point Douglas out to a First Nation reserve and do the same thing?
Yes. As a matter of fact, some of that has already naturally happened. One of the prototypes we were so fortunate to work on was at the very beginning stages. It was called the Manitoba Indigenous Doula Initiative. That was its first iteration. It has now led to, and it was really driven by 4 amazing Indigenous women leaders, business leaders who are actually leading a lot of things right now, not to mention the, Agowidiiwinan, there's 2 of them over there running things. But, those 4 women had a real vision about how the concept of bringing children into this world and that birth work could look for Indigenous people, which was different than what the doula, the mainstream doula concept was. And so from there, they really put together training and ideas about how we might embed this in actually First Nations communities. The idea of evacing pregnant women out of communities so they can be evac'd into Winnipeg to have a child is just probably the worst way to bring children into this world. And so probably one of the most expensive ones and the most harmful ones for baby and mom. And so what might we do different by having that birth work situated right in communities? And so that's the work, I got to say that out of that initial prototyping, as it iterated and as it started to scale, 2 businesses were formed out of that and by those Indigenous women. And so they created businesses. And so one of those businesses, Agowidiiwinan, is off doing amazing work, training. They've got a whole training platform and they're training, I don't even know, if they're international. I don't even know how many people they've trained through their program now, just lots. The other was Agowidiiwinan, which is really trying to look at how we keep families together and is being a real viable solution to the child welfare system in terms of taking children into care and having to again, quote unquote, care for kids that way. So again, just those have scaled. The Agowidiiwinan actually took one of our other prototypes, which was the baby basket prototype, and went into a community with that. And the community actually scaled that and took it into a more communal approach. The baby basket the stage of prototyping that we had it at was to work with individuals. And so there was, literally a basket that would go to families that were having a child. Whereas that community that Agowidiiwinan was working with said, you know what, we want to do a community basket, if you will. And so they pooled all the resources, again, that collaboration, that collective approach. And they did an honoring ceremony for all the babies coming into that community. They did, cultural teachings. They just did a big community feast and celebration. So they took this concept from individuality over into a collective approach, we didn't have anything to do with that. It was just gone on its own doing that. And we were, again, just thoroughly impressed and always amazed and, just heartened to see what our community does when they are in charge and where they take things. It's just beyond, the sophistication, impact is over the top.
Yeah. Well, that's so fantastic. And I love the enthusiasm, the energy, because what you're saying is you're delivering the energy because you see these things being positive. You see these things working, have a positive impact on the community. I'm almost hesitant to ask you this question because it could be a whole other podcast, because I look at what you're doing and the leadership you're providing. And I guess, if I were to ask you if you think that Canada would ever be ready to abolish, or I don't know if the right word is, but the reserve system as we know it today. I mean, you talk about systems. That is probably through the Indian Act, which is how it was developed. But is it something you would ever see, or you hope in your lifetime, that we don't have reserves for First Nations anymore?
Well, so of course, my response to that is going to be, if Indigenous people decide we need to abolish the Indian Act, then that's what will happen, right? And so again, it's about putting Indigenous folks at the center of that conversation and in the decision-making place about that conversation, because the Indian Act, at the end of the day, does affect Indigenous people most directly, out of all the nations and all the different people in this country. So if Indigenous people want that to happen, then it should happen. I think there's a lot of work, but I'm also hopeful and very confident in Indigenous people to be able to come up with something different, or a different relationship with Canada. I think that connection to land will always be. And so this idea of a reservation system, I would separate out the legality of that from the land-based relationship. I do think that there are some downsides to the Indian Act right now, in terms of, it gets in the way of access to capital. It gets in the way of acquiring assets that's much needed when you're trying to be in the mainstream loan and capital acquisition world. So I think there's some changes that definitely need to happen there. But I think right now there is a high level of distrust that, Canada will take Indigenous people's best interest at heart when they go to dismantle their own constitution. And so I think that's where the reticence is the lack of trust that Canada would do that in a way that satisfies Indigenous people. And that's why I say, it needs to be Indigenous people at the forefront of that change. And then Indigenous people will design something way better than an Indian Act, is what I believe. And so I do have hope. I mean, at the end of the day, I also think it's going to go there no matter what. It has to go there. It's going to go there. And so, we want to be able to have these conversations in a collaborative way. But at some point, Indigenous people are just standing up and just saying enough. And we're just taking our place, and we're just, going to go in this direction, and you can lead, follow, or get out of the way.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. Diane Roussin, it took me a while to finally be able to get you to find the time to come on this podcast. I can't thank you enough, just as literally somebody who is proud to call Winnipeg, Manitoba home. I'm passionate about this community, and listening to you today, Diane, and the great work that you and your team are doing makes me only more passionate, because I really do think that we are blessed with people in this community like you, who on a day-by-day basis with your team are making this a better place for people to call home. And it's not something that happens overnight. It takes a village of people, a team of people, and we're blessed to have your leadership making that difference. So I just want to simply say, Diane Roussin, Executive Director of the Winnipeg Boldness Project, and so many other things that you're involved in. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for being who you are.
Well, I also want to express the same gratitude, Stuart. So, Kichimigwech, which means very big thank you in Anishinaabe, for seeking me out. I know I can sometimes be hard to reach. So thank you for being persistent about that. It matters. I am always happy to share with audiences that want to hear. Like I said earlier, there's some folks who don't want to hear this. And so I always appreciate when people take the time to listen and to thoughtfully listen, because some of what I'm saying is not easy to digest, and it's not easy to take. So, if folks could be courageous and brave in their listening. And hopefully what I've said here today, for those who are listening, hopefully it's just sparked a curiosity and an interest that you might then seek more information on any part of what I might have said. Just know that as Canadians, this has not been taught to us in a systematic way. It has not been in our school system. So if you don't know some of these things, it's because it was not taught. And so that's part of the reconciliation, is that, we need to get this into our, knowledge transfer institution systems in a more structured, resourced way. And and so I always appreciate the podcasts and the invites to come and speak. And for the audiences out there, for whoever's listening, I do want to also thank you for taking the time to listen today.
Okay, Diane, we shall be in touch again, but thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Humans on Rights. A transcript of this episode is available by clicking the link in the show notes of this episode. Humans on Rights is recorded and hosted by Stuart Murray. Social media marketing by Buffy Davey. Music by Doug Edmond. For more, go to humanrightshub.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.